In this presentation, we will review our job cost system number 1, our first job cost system within QuickBooks Pro, QuickBooks Desktop. Here we are in our QuickBooks file. We're in the problem 1, our example problem 1, job cost tracking, work in process. We currently have the open windows open. To open the open windows, you go to the view drop-down up top and go into the open windows list. This is the completed file of a practice problem that we will be working in the future. If you don't have access to this file, that's okay because we're not adding anything new to this file. We will be starting this problem from scratch in the future. First thing we want to do is look at our Excel file, and we're always going to be going back to the Excel file just to think about our objectives. What are our objectives? What do we need from the Excel file? That's basically everything on one page type of file so we can see all the kind of connections. How are we going to enter that into the QuickBooks system? So you'll recall that we have our balance sheet over here, our balance sheet and income statement, in essence our trial balance over here. Within our trial balance, we've been recording items to the raw materials, to the work in process, to the finished goods. These are all inventory type of items that go into whatever job it is that we are creating. And then of course, once it's out of finished goods, it goes to cost of goods sold when we sell the item. So the flow is going to be, it's going to start in raw materials, it's going to go to work in process, it's going to go to finished goods, and then we're going to sell it, it's going to go to cost of goods sold. We need to support all this information because there's a lot of items in this account, not just by the general ledger detail accounts, but by a subsidiary ledger. And if we go over to the right side, we recorded that here in the job cost records. We have the subsidiary ledger with 3 jobs in this case. The 3 jobs are then broken out by direct materials, direct labor, and the factory overhead in each. So we need to know which jobs are there and then be able to add up the jobs and the detail within them. Not only that, but we need to be able to track the jobs that have been open, the jobs that are closed, and the jobs that have basically been shipped so that we can use this sheet in order to tie out to the work in process account, the finished goods account, and the cost of goods sold account. Now, as we did this, we had to use different type of mechanisms to enter this into the system. We had to enter a journal entry to enter it into the general ledger or trial balance, and then we had to enter the detail by job into the job cost sheets. And we could only give so much detail, like the direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead are kind of generic type of accounts. We could give more detail than that, which we'll see in future problems. So how can we do those types of things in QuickBooks? If we go back to QuickBooks, let's first consider the main reports that we're going to be working with. Now, the major 2 reports are the financial statement still, the balance sheet and the income statement or profit and loss. Let's take a look at those. We're going to go to the reports dropdown. We're going to go to the company and financial. We're going to first go down to the balance sheet standard. Balance sheet standard report. I'm going to change the dates. I like to do that with the customized reports up top so that we can then have a date range. The date range we will be working with is 01/01/20 to 12/31/20 and enter. So it's 2020, January 2020 to December 2020 and OK. So here is going to be our data for the balance sheet. So we've got the cash, we got the accounts receivable, raw materials, work in process. These are the accounts that we're kind of focused in on as inventory accounts, the raw materials, the work in process. Those accounts should be supported by some kind of work in process report, a jobs report. We got the factory equipment, accumulated depreciation, the accounts payable, and then the equity section. Now let's take a look at a profit and loss report. If we go to the reports dropdown, we're going to go to the company and financial, and then we'll take a look at the profit and loss standard report. We're going to change the dates up top from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. And within the profit and loss, we're only going to be looking at these jobs. So really all we have here in the profit and loss is that one job that had been completed. We have the income for that job, just as we did when we sold the job, you'll recall. We sold the job and we had income of that 241 and the 183. And that means we had income of 58,800, 58,800, 58,800. And all of the costs that were included in that job number 14 are grouped on the income statement under the cost of goods sold. They're all part of the cost of goods sold process. Now, the next thing we're going to need to look at, the report that we're actually going to spend a lot more time with, is going to be the trial balance, because the trial balance gives us all this information in one report. It removes these subtotals. So we're going to use the trial balance a lot. If you're not used to the debits and credits on the trial balance, that's okay, because really all you need to know is the account balances in it. So it's really a useful form, even to show others, even if they're not, don't know the debits and credits as well. So I'm going to go to the reports up top, accounting and taxes, and look at the trial balance. And we'll take a look at the date range from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. So January through December 2020, there is our trial balance. And this then ties out to what we have on our Excel worksheet. So here's our Excel worksheet. It's in format of debits and credits. There's our ending trial balance numbers. And here is our ending trial balance. Here's in the form of debits and credits. In this format, the credits are on the right, the debits on the left. Basically, we want to see is the accounts that are going up and down. We've removed the subtotals. We have both the balance sheet accounts, which end at the equity section, and the income statement accounts on the trial balance. Now, what we want to be looking at is the report that's going to be supporting the work in progress report. The main report that is going to support the work in progress report is going to be under the reports dropdown. We're going to be looking at these reports in the job, time, and mileage. And we want to then go to the job estimate versus actual. So when we use this system, this is the main report that we will be entering. So we're going to look at this one. And then now this is as of, it usually just goes till the end of the time period. So it's going to show all the jobs. And you'll note that one of our goals over here was to be able to indicate which jobs were open and closed, so we can determine where they will then be on the trial balance. So we had these two jobs. This one was shipped. This one was closed. So in essence, these ones are still held by the company. This one has been shipped out. So if we go back to the QuickBooks file, one mechanism we can have to do that is to actually change the name of the job to indicate this one is closed, this one is completed and not closed, and then have the one that is open. So we can manipulate this report in that way, and that'll help us to manipulate the report. We can also change the status of the report. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to actually have to create these jobs, then change the status. So the way we create a job here is we go to the customers up top, we go to the customer center, and we've created these jobs under the Smith customer, job 14, 15, and 16. Now we could have multiple jobs for multiple different customers. They could be in the same customer. The concept of the jobs that are being opened and closed will remain the same. Once we have the job set up, we could then go into the status of the job. So job number 14, and I can change the status. So as we'll go through the problem, we'll use this as one of our mechanisms. We've labeled it as closed in the job status, closing this back out, closing this back out. That also allows us to filter this report. So we can go to the customized reports up top, filters. We can filter by the status of the report. If we scroll down, we want the job status, and then I can say I just want to see the open items. So if I want to see the in progress numbers, I can take a look at the in progress numbers. So that's the amount that is not completed and still in progress. I'm also going to go back to the customer tab in the customer center. And the one that is completed, it hasn't been shipped, so I'm going to keep that one open for now too. So I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to go to the job status. I'm going to change it from pending to in progress and say okay. And then if I close this back out, you can see that then changes the open versus the closed. The actual costs are here at the 574. The 574 on the trial balance. Then if we go back to the trial balance, there's the 574. The amount in cost of goods sold is the 183. So we see how we can tie these out to the job cost sheets. Now the next thing is, of course, how do we do this? How are we going to enter this information? What's the mechanism that allows us to enter the information? One of our objectives on the Excel sheet is to allow us to enter things that are going to be in a journal entry format, and then enter them also into the job in a kind of system that we hopefully have to do less data input, and in a system where it's less likely that we're going to end up with the job cost sheets not tying out to what are on the GL accounts. Now, the way to do that under this system within QuickBooks is to use items. We're going to be using items in order to drive these types of transactions. And the items are going to be a little bit different than you might expect or you have seen in the past. If we go back to the Home tab then, we're in the Home tab in the open windows. You'll recall that when we set up an invoice, oftentimes we'll have items that we will be using. The items are going to be the items that we are going to apply here and then apply out some rate to so that we can charge people and bill people, invoice people, and customers. So that's the way we will use the invoice. We'll use them in that format here. However, we're also going to be using them to be driving the job tracking. So this is going to be kind of the new thing. This is the basis of using this type of system within QuickBooks. I'm going to close this back out. I'm going to say OK. What we're going to do then is we're going to set up items. I'm going to go to the lists drop down. We're going to go to the item list. Now within the item list, you can see we've set up these types of items, and what we want to look at is one of the direct materials, the direct labor, and the factory overhead. These are the three types of items we set up, general kind of categories. Later we'll get into more detailed type of categories, breaking out the material, more detailed items, but now we just have these general three. If we were to double click on one of these items, then the big thing that we have different is that we have checked this box which says this service is used for assembly or in performance by a subcontractor or partner. What that does is it opens up this item to be looking more like an inventory type of item in that we have a cost side and a sales side. Now what happens then is we're going to assign the cost side when we use this item. Normally, you could put this account to like an expense account. Normally, it would go to an expense account. You can see here it says expense account, such as cost of goods sold. However, here we're going to assign this to the work in process account. And what that'll do then is when we use this item, it will then be going to, if we go back to the trial balance, it'll be going to the work in process account here. And that's going to be increasing the work in process when we have something like a purchase of the item. So any direct labor and direct materials that we purchase then are going to be directed towards the work in process. So we're going to use the item in order to drive that type of transaction. If we go back to the item then, the item list, and I go back into that item, then on the other side, we're going to have the sales side, and it's going to go to an income account. And that means obviously when we invoice the client and we assign the invoice for it, it's going to be increasing the income account. We're going to keep the amounts zero because we're going to be filling out those amounts as we go. So this will be the major tool that we will be using. Now, if I close this back out and I close out the items, note that if I go back to Excel, we entered all of our transactions with the journal entries. Now, in QuickBooks, we're not going to be using the journal entries for a few different reasons. One is any normal transaction we have within QuickBooks, we try to use the forms so that we don't have to use the debits and credits, right? We have the form that should make the data input easier as we enter it into the system. And two, we're going to need the forms in order to drive the jobs. So in other words, like if I tried to just enter the debits and credits into QuickBooks, if I go to the company file and I go to the make journal entry, there's nothing in this journal entry format that allows us to use the item, and the item is the thing that drives us to be able to link the job cost sheet to the GL and tie that out. So we can't use the journal entry even in those cases where the journal entry might be the most appropriate thing to use in a system if it weren't for the fact that we need to also track the job cost system. Therefore, we're going to have to use forms in a way that we're not really used to. We're going to have to use the forms in a way that QuickBooks kind of recommends for a job cost system to do. So we have to use them in that format. However, it's not something that we would normally think of the form to be used for. We'll do things like having a check with a zero balance in it because we're basically entering a journal entry. So let's see what that would look like. If I close this back out, and this is one of the confusing things to using this system, which is the system that QuickBooks set up the forms to be used in this way generally for a job cost type of system. However, it can be a little bit confusing to do, and that's why when you consider the different types of systems, you want to consider, how easy it is to input, how well you understand the system. So I'm going to close this back out. All these data input items, these are considered forms for QuickBooks. These are going to be the things that will drive the transactions, the journal entries on the trial balance or the financial statements. So if we were to open something like a check, let's say if I open up a check, this is a data input form that we would enter the data into. The main items that we're considering here on the check are the fact that we have the expenses tab and the items tab. This items tab is the one where we can enter those items that we set up, those double-sided items. And if we use the items instead of the expenses, like if you use the expense tab, then you can choose an account, right? You can choose an account to go to in a similar fashion as the journal entry. But the account will not also drive it to the job cost sheet. So we can't use the account when we want something to affect the work in process account. So, and you'll recall every time, that means every time we had something go to work in process here, when we worked this problem, we now need to use an item for. We can't just use a journal entry. We have to use we have to use the mechanism that we have set up, which is going to be items, to be able to link the work in process account and the job cost sheet. So to do that, we're going to have to use the check, and then we'll use the items tab. And that'll allow us to write the check down here and choose the item. And let's take a look at an example of that. I'm going to up here to the back arrow or the left arrow. We're going to say left arrow once. I'm going to keep on going back again. We're going to keep on going back, going back, going back, factory overhead. And let's take a look at this item. This one's the direct labor. So we have the direct labor here. Within the direct labor, we had a check written for $218,000. Then we applied it to the item of direct labor, not the expense, but the item. And then we applied it to the jobs over here for the customer. These are the customers, 14, 15, and 16, which are the jobs as well. These allow us to make it billable when we create the invoice. This will allow us, when we create the invoice, to pull this information into the invoice. What will this journal entry do? Or what will this check do? What will this form do? It will be then decreasing the checking account, of course, by the 218. The other side will be driven by the item. Notice these aren't accounts, these are items. The item, as we set up, is going to work in process. So the other side of this will be going to the work in process as has been instructed by the item, and it will also be included in the job cost reports. That's the key here. That's why we need to use the items for that. So if I go, for example, to the trial balance, and I was to go into the work in process account and double click on the work in process account, we'll see the detail for it, and we'll see these checks involved in here. And then again, if I go into any of these checks, we're going to see the detail for the check, and there's the direct labor check. So if I close that back out, that's in the work in process account, and that's also what's going to help to link it to the estimate versus actual report here. Job estimate versus actual. We have the job estimate versus actual. Now, if we want more detail on each of these jobs, we can break out the job detail report. We go to the reports drop down. We can go to the job time and mileage, and we can go to the job estimate versus actual detailed report, where we would then have to choose an actual job like job number 14 and say OK. And that'll give us some more detail. So now it's giving us the detail of the costs of the job for job number 14 for the direct labor, material, and overhead. And then that job was closed out. So now it's basically closed out because we closed out that job. Back to the home tab. So that's going to be the major forms that we're going to be using. If I go back into the check again, let's open up another check over here. Now, notice that we're going to have to use checks in kind of funny ways too. If I go back to a previous check, for example, one that has a zero balance in it, like this check has a zero balance in it. So notice, why are we writing a check with a zero balance? Because we're using the check to do basically a journal entry. This is something that normally it would make sense to do a journal entry with, but we couldn't use the journal entry because we wanted to use the items. So in this case, this was a factory overhead item that we needed to record, and the other side is going to go to the expenses for the factory overhead. This is going to be to take it out of the factory overhead and put it into the work in process account. So this is a little bit unnatural. This takes a little bit getting used to write a check like this that has, and using these items in this way. Most of the times we don't use the items that are double-sided, and it can be a little bit confusing. And when we have to write these checks in order to do a journal entry, it could take a little bit getting used to. So we'll see that process as we go. If I'm going to close this back out. Now, once the job is completed, we'll actually create an invoice for it. So we're going to go over here to the invoice, and we're going to create an invoice. If I go back to an invoice, notice we can create an invoice, and we can do that by having those billable items. So that two-sided item thing could help us out to create the invoice at the end of the process as well. And of course, the invoice, what's the invoice going to do? It's going to be increasing the sales, and it's going to be increasing the accounts receivable. So that's the basic format here. So our main tool we're going to be using are going to be those double-sided items that we'll be using to be able to process this to the two reports. If I close this back out, then other reports that we might consider, if we go to the reports dropdown and we go to the jobs, times, and mileage, we looked at these two reports. You can also have an item profitability report. If we go into the item profitability report, it will be breaking out basically the income account by item. In other words, we set up these three items. These are not accounts: the direct labor, the materials, and the overhead. And those all point to the same income account. So that 241,800 will then tie out to the profit and loss report for that one income account of the 241,800. So that's going to be an outline of the tools that we're going to be using. We're going to be working mainly with the trial balance and the job versus estimate report. Note as well that when we go into the home tab, we will be starting this off, and we will be entering the estimates when we start this off as well. We haven't been concentrating on the estimates when we looked at the Excel problem. You have to enter the estimate in Excel in QuickBooks under this system in order to be able to run the reports that we need to run. So even if you do an estimate outside of QuickBooks, then you still need to kind of enter it into QuickBooks or something into QuickBooks so that we can run the reports that will be necessary.